Talk a little bit more about the process of how an MRI works, and when is the right time that somebody thinks a CT scan is going to work, and then when actually you ought to be thinking about an MRI.
Absolutely. Well, first, a little bit about how MRI works. Believe it or not, inside the nuclei, inside the atoms, inside the water, inside you,
Okay.
there are these tiny little magnets, almost like compass needles. And if you put them in a really strong magnetic field, just like compass needles, they align. And if you then hit them with radio waves from a radio antenna of just the right frequency, they'll start zipping around in that magnetic field, and they generate a little radio signal. So believe it or not, under those circumstances, you and I and everyone are living, breathing radio transmitters. And it turns out that by tracking where the signal's coming from using these principles of tomography, you can generate a map of the water inside your body. So that's what an MRI is at baseline. It's a map of the wet tissues of the water. So what that tells you is a little bit about what MRI sees. MRI sees the soft, squishy tissues. Where you might use an MRI is where you really want to see what's going on inside the brain tissue, the heart, the liver, the prostate, the breast, things like that. Where you might want to use a CAT scan instead is where you're really interested in the bony structures, the hard structures. You want to see if there's a fracture. You want to see if there's calcium inside a coronary artery. Now, both of them can be used for either. That's where each one of them excels.
Okay. And the fields even of MRI are evolving, and you were instrumental personally in developing something called parallel imaging. And I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how that came up and why it was such a meaningful evolution.
Well, one reinvention I had the privilege of stumbling into was something called parallel imaging. So MRI, before that time, had been gathered more or less sequentially, almost like a scanner. Right? If you have a digital scanner or an old-fashioned fax machine, I'm not sure how many of your listeners remember what a fax machine is, you sort of scan through line by line until you get the image. In the case of MRI, it was projection by projection, but it's the same idea. I was at the time, this was back in 1996, I was doing a rotation with a physician, a cardiac imager named Warren Manning, who liked to image the heart, and it's sort of considered bad form to stop the heart while you're imaging it. The heart is constantly moving, and you need to somehow capture that, so speed is important, right? And I started asking myself, well, what are the limits? I knew nothing about MRI at that point. What are the limits of speed in MRI? Why is it slow? And it occurred to me it's slow because we're gathering one projection at a time. And so I just asked myself the question, is there a way of gathering multiple projections at the same time, like getting 2 lines of the scanner or 3 or 4 lines of the scanner at once? And I realized that we were using these radio detectors to pick up the signal. What if we had an array of detectors around different parts of the body? Could we use those to get multiple different projections in parallel? Turns out we could, hence parallel imaging.
Okay. And in terms of that advancing the science, how has that impacted how we operate today?
Well, interestingly, in medical imaging in particular, time is money. Time is of the essence, partly because you want to scan as many people as you can in these busy, expensive scanners, partly because it's hard for patients, particularly sick patients, to hold still. And there are parts of the body that, as I was talking about before, refuse to hold still, like the heart. And so what parallel imaging allowed us to do was to do all of the things that we could do before, but faster.
Got it. Now, you call this streaming perception. Is that the word you used for it?
Well, so in a way, it enabled something that I like to call streaming, as opposed to snapshots. The old tomography took a long time, almost like an old camera that needed a long exposure. But the faster we went, the more we could image life sort of in living color in real time.
Got it. And so are the majority now of MRI machines set up to work in parallel imaging?
They are. It certainly was very gratifying for me to see, because speed is so essential and so valuable. Manufacturers very quickly picked up the concept of parallel imaging and put it on their scanners. So now I'd say the majority of MRI scans taken around the world use parallel imaging in one way or another.
That's pretty impressive. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm proud and quite a bit humbled by that.
But you didn't stop there. You got involved in something else called compressed sensing. And tell us where this idea came from and how that has evolved.
Let's say you want to send somebody a photo in your email, right? You then get a question: do you want it small, medium, or large?
Right.
We compress the image in order to store it efficiently with something like a JPEG algorithm, something like that. But that leads to the question: if I can compress my data and throw away lots of these data points, why do I need to spend all this time gathering it in the first place? What compressed sensing is a way of cleverly figuring out pre-compression. Before you even know what's in the image, you essentially gather the data you need to get a compressed representation of it, almost like you're gathering the JPEG first and then uncompress it, rather than gathering all the data, taking a long time, and then figuring out what to throw away. So this pre-compression allowed us to speed things up even further, and it turned out compressed sensing worked really well in combination with parallel imaging too.
Okay, and how is that worked into the science that we're utilizing today?
Well, I think one really gratifying thing about working in the field of imaging is that as soon as you have a new development, it can propagate very quickly to all manner of disciplines. So, these acceleration techniques are being used clinically to image patients faster and clearer, but they're also being used in basic research to get more data in the same time, for example, to help characterize new types of diseases or even new types of materials in physics.
Okay. If I can pause for a second, and because we're going down the medicine path, but let's go back to other areas of our world where imaging is prevalent. And space exploration, telescopes you talked about. Can you spend a little time talking about the evolution, because we can certainly talk about Magellan and other advances in telescopes, but these are all parts of imaging. How has that imaging evolved as well?
People did not stop once they had developed these nice telescope or microscope tubes. They kept on tinkering and pushing the limits. And it turns out one of the things that in astronomy in particular was a key enabler was to make these tubes bigger. So basically bigger is better when it comes to astronomy because of the limits of spatial resolution.
Okay.
So we have had this remarkable explosion in the size and power of these artificial eyes that look out into space, to the extent that now we have something called the Event Horizon Telescope. And that's what gave us our first view a few years ago of a black hole, our first actual visual picture of a black hole.
Remarkable. Advances in imaging in one field inevitably leads to different understandings of how imaging can be used in other fields as well.
Absolutely. I think of imaging as one vast evolutionary tree in a way. People tend to think of astronomy or microscopy or medical imaging as very distinct disciplines, and often the people working in them kind of have their heads down and are focusing there. But actually, they're all branches of this great tree. I've had some extraordinary experiences sitting down with radio astronomers, for example, who have these huge dishes trained outward, and we have our MRI machines that are looking inside. I sat down with one radio astronomer back a few years ago, Urvashi Rao, whom I profile a little bit in the book. And as we were going through the talks we were supposed to give, these paired talks at a conference bringing astronomers together with medical imagers, we discovered that our talks were basically the same. The mathematics underlying how we did radio astronomy were almost identical with a few notation changes to how we did MRI. So it turns out a radio telescope is like an MRI machine turned inside out. Who knew?